This is Duke University.
Well, welcome all of you and to this Foundation Impact Research Group seminar. I'm delighted to have you all here. We're especially pleased to have Judith Rodin here and her husband Paul Berkyle. They've been here before, and it's always a pleasure to welcome them back. Judith Rodin is a pioneer, innovator, change maker. I didn't write this, so
neither.
I'm complimenting you. I want you to know I adopt everything that's in here. Judith Rodin is a pioneer, innovator, change maker, and global thought leader. For over 2 decades, Rodin led and transformed 2 global institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation and the University of Pennsylvania. A groundbreaking executive throughout her career, Dr. Rodin was the first woman named to lead an Ivy League institution and was the first woman to serve as the Rockefeller Foundation's president. A research psychologist by training, she was one of the pioneers of the behavioral medicine and health psychology movements. Dr. Rodin's leadership ushered the Rockefeller Foundation into a new era of strategic philanthropy that emphasized partnerships with business, government, and the philanthropic community to address and solve for the complex challenges of the 21st century. Rodin championed 2 whole new fields that are now pervasive: resilience and impact investing. And I can tell you from my own knowledge of the field that Judy is the one who really put resilience on the national agenda and language. And you see it everywhere now. Not just with respect to foundations and universities, but with the society, and in a society in which we can't begin to anticipate all the problems that are going to have to happen and do something to avoid them. It's good to concentrate on resilience, so when it happens, you'll know how to bounce back. And so I think I do attribute that, I think, accurately to Judy. And the same thing is probably true of impact investing. It isn't as widely known as resilience as a phrase, but nonetheless, it has certainly grown a great deal as a consequence of her leadership. At Penn, Dr. Rodin presided over an unprecedented decade of growth and progress that transformed the institution, its campus, and the community, taking the university from 16th to 4th in the U.S. News and World Report national rankings. The university also engineered a comprehensive, internationally acclaimed neighborhood revitalization program in West Philadelphia. And indeed, when Judy was running Penn and revitalizing West Philadelphia, I was at the Atlantic Philanthropies, and we saw that effort on the ground, step by step, and amazed by how well it worked and the vision that it embodied. Rodin has served as a member of the board for several leading corporations and many nonprofits. She has authored more than 250 academic articles and chapters and has written or co-written 15 books, including her 2 most recent, The Power of Impact Investing, Putting Markets to Work for Profit and Global Good, and The Resilience Dividend, Being Strong in a World Where Things Go Wrong. So Judy, it's a pleasure to welcome you here again. Paul, it's wonderful to have you here as well. You don't know, most of you don't know the fact that Paul taught at Chapel Hill in the law school. And he came to the law school at Chapel Hill about, I think, almost the same time I came to the Duke Law School. And he was my mentor in administrative law. I'm not sure that was a favor, because administrative law is a kind of law course that changes from spring semester to the fall semester, like 150 new cases. But in any event, he did get me started in the field. And I did suffer through 6 years of teaching that course, and then just told the dean, I don't want to teach that course anymore. I want a course that doesn't ever change, like torts. and I didn't get torts, but I got out of administrative law.
Well, I wasn't so lucky.
In any event, Paul, welcome to you, and Judy, a special welcome to you. Thank you so much for coming.
It's wonderful to be here, and so thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Joel, I know, has a special place in all your hearts, and certainly does in mine. He was a mentor, a really important mentor, as I entered the labyrinthine world of philanthropy, trying to figure out what it really was all about. And why suddenly, after being a university president where no one listened to you, I had become a foundation president where everyone thought you were smart and clever and charming and wonderful. And Joel told me the truth, so it was a terrific entree, and I continued to be able to consult with Joel and ask his advice and always know that I would get very good and candid feedback. It's great that Paul is here with me. This area has special resonance for both of us, certainly to Paul during his early years at Chapel Hill, and then more recently we are the parent of a Duke graduate, and Alex was very active here and vice president of the student government, a Durham police officer.
She's talking literally, a Durham police
literally
officer who carried a weapon and rode in a police car
at the same time, and had a unique undergraduate experience, I would say, much to his parents' chagrin. But it has a special place, and Nan and I were good friends as presidents together. Richard Broadhead and I grew up together at Yale. We came the same year, we were department chairs the same year, we were co-deans before I became provost and he came here. So all of these wonderful and of course Vince Price was the Penn provost, so lots of great connections, and so good to see all of you. Joel asked me to talk a bit about what we tried to think through at Rockefeller as I had the privilege of leading that storied institution. All of you know, of course, that it is one of America's first foundations. We in Carnegie sort of tussle about who's really first based on incorporation and where. But one of the most interesting things that I saw when I became president was in the Rockefeller archives, a series of letters between John D. and Andrew Carnegie, where they're communicating with each other before each of them formed the foundation, and really talking about what was this new thing they were conceiving that was philanthropy, which they both felt was going to be different than charity. They wanted it to be different from charity, and they were sort of figuring out how. And they went in different directions in terms of the things that they chose to fund in those early years. But both, of course, have had a profound influence on the evolution of philanthropy in America and certainly around the world. Rockefeller was the first global foundation. It was giving more foreign aid than the US government until the Marshall Plan. And so when you think about the impact of those early foundations, and of course Carnegie was building these amazing libraries and transforming so many institutions, and you think about their impact. So for me, coming into this, my knowledge of grant making was really writing grant proposals to NIH as a research scientist, and there was an awful lot to learn. But the one thing I knew for sure is that when you have a foundation with that kind of history and legacy, you ought to be deeply focused on impact. And you think about the early years of Rockefeller, I think until the Second World War, it really was directly working. It was what we today would call an operating foundation. It was on the ground, its scientists were on the ground, its grant officers were on the ground, and they were running everything with huge operations in place as they worked around the world. After the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions were formed, they recognized that they no longer had to sort of stand in for multilateralism, which is what Rockefeller and its leaders felt like they were doing until then, and instead began to understand, and Joel has written so beautifully about the importance of this, that they needed to develop the non-governmental organizations. And so Rockefeller, Ford, and some of the other larger US foundations really began the infrastructure of so many of the civil society organizations that we know today, and really built their capacity and built them to be another rail, not to stand in for government, often to criticize government, not to stand in for the private sector, often there too, to criticize the actions of the private sector, but be that civil society that was both the infrastructure and in some ways the conscience of the second half of the 20th century. Now fast forward, I'm coming in almost at the beginning of the 21st century. And so the question that we asked ourselves, and we have an amazing mission. So our mission is for the betterment of humankind, because John Dee felt that every generation would interpret that in a different way based on the issues and the problems that the leaders saw in their current moment or their current generation, and wanted really to create the flexibility to do that, which was extremely prescient, I think. So with that background, I had the opportunity to ask two questions. What could we do to double our impact? Let's not go and get baseline measures. Let's not ask ourselves how much impact we're having now, which is kind of a threatening question. But let's just ask ourselves, if we wanted to free our minds and double our impact, what would we do? So the impact question. And then the second question was, if we have the right and the ability from our mission statement to really lean into the problems and the issues of our generation, what are they and how can we really figure them out? And so we spent my first year or two really addressing both of those things. For the first, it was a real focus on impact and innovation. And to answer the second, it was consulting with experts all over the world about the ways that the world was changing, the problems and the opportunities, and how we as a foundation could lean into that. As a result of those two explorations, we came to a structure, and the reason that I just want to talk about the structure for a moment is that you will then, I think, understand why we did what we did and chose the topics that we did. So our structure was to focus on what we came to call internally the 3 I's for impact, which were innovation, intervention, and influence. And we concluded that all 3 were critical, that they supported one another, but that they were not the same. And so we could vertically work on them, but we could also look at their intersections to create some outsized impact, we believed. The focus on innovation, I think, was very critical for our thinking. Obviously, we learned from and consulted with huge varieties of experts on innovation, both in the public and the private sector, and in the academy. And we came to understand that there were multiple types of innovation, that when the general public thinks about innovation, you're thinking about that shiny new product, the iMac, the mouse, and product innovation is, of course, critical. But for our kind of work, perhaps the other kinds of innovation were equally or more important. And they are process innovation, organizational innovation, and markets innovation. And we leaned heavily into all 3, and I'm going to come back to that. In our work in innovation, we really emphasized risk-taking. We all know, working as we do, that in some ways philanthropic capital is America's risk capital, is tax-advantaged money. And if we treat that too conservatively, we're not really using the capital with sufficient taking sufficient risk to really push the envelope of new ways of thinking, new ways of acting, that philanthropy and our resources enable us to do. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about and then putting into action the concept of failing safely, which often is talked about, but often not supported organizationally sufficiently, and we worked hard at that. Another part of innovation that we focused on was opening ourselves to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And so we began a process, and it fed over into our intervention space as well, that we called Scan and Search. We funded think tanks, universities, some NGOs on the ground in various parts, all over the world, actually. And they were our eyes and ears on the ground, our sensing mechanisms for how things were changing and new things were evolving. What we were looking for through the Scan and Search process was dynamism in a space. We all know what the big problems are. What we wanted to focus on with our limited resources were where was something looking like the terrain was shifting. There was some dynamism, a new discovery, a new government, a new kind of partnership, and the like, where suddenly something that may have seemed intractable suddenly felt like it was, the ground was shifting and the dynamism might allow new ways of acting and new ways of thinking. And through Scan and Search, we had real-time information, and it wasn't coming from the McKinsey Global Trends or whatever. It was coming from the kinds of thinkers and organizations that all of us feel more compatible with and that we feel we can learn more effectively from. So that whole mechanism, we crowdsourced quite a bit. We ran several global competitions. We ran innovation competitions, we ran entrepreneurship competitions, any way that we could get our arms around what was happening out there. And our mantra was, you know, all the great ideas don't come from 420 Fifth Avenue. And that helped us sort of turn ourselves around more and open ourselves, I think, more effectively to new ideas. The third innovation for us, which made a huge difference in our work, was we experimented with how to leverage and unlock different forms of capital than just our philanthropic dollars. It became, we were obviously, and here the motivation was dual. We were a $4.5 billion foundation, which meant about $200 million a year, which in this era is actually very little money. And so we asked ourselves, not only should we partner with other foundations and philanthropies, but we all know that all of the philanthropic capital together is only a microcosm of solving the world's problems. When Patty Stonecipher was the CEO of Gates and everybody was saying, oh, you know, God, you're giving so much money, it'll change the world, she would remind people that their entire annual giving budget was less than the public school budget of the state of California. So just to put numbers into perspective. So we are a relatively small actor in terms of resources. And so we looked at what was sitting on the sidelines so far, and that was private investment capital. Not corporations, but the private investors, where there were trillions of dollars under investment. And so began the thinking around developing the double bottom line investment strategy, where we really could, and this came both from the recognition of the resources, but also the global trends. You could start to see the millennials were different. They were going, many of them were going to inherit huge amounts of family wealth. And they didn't want to just get financial returns. They were socially active young people, and they were really part of the momentum of thinking that you could shift an industry towards thinking about double bottom line returns, where you would get financial as well as social and environmental returns. And we made a decision at the time that rather than invest our money in an impact investing funds, we would invest our grant making in building the infrastructure for the field. So all the metrics, what I always called with my team the plumbing, the things that others aren't going to invest in, the platforms, so the Global Impact Investors Network, the new policy frameworks that were necessary, the B Corp, so we were the first funder of B Labs and the whole idea of B Corp, and then the entire industry around social impact bonds was originally funded by Rockefeller work. And that notion of leverage, which at first was just financial capital leverage, came to be part of our internal narrative about what we wanted to accomplish generally. So we would say to each other when we were looking at our grant opportunities, if we spend $1 to get $1's worth of impact, shame on us. We need to get leverage for every dollar we spend. So sometimes it's bringing in other capital, but other times it's getting more bangs for a single buck. And how can we think about that in designing our grant making, in our thinking? And again, I'll come back to that when I talk about resilience. So that was sort of our innovation pathway. Our intervention pathway is the more traditional standard grant making. You see a problem, you design a set of solutions, you intervene with your partners and your grantees to improve the lives and livelihoods of beneficiaries on the ground. Because we had this scanning process as part of our openness to new ideas, it was really easy to start thinking about how to begin an intervention. So we worked with the scans. We actually had about 40 every quarter. We picked 5 or 6 that we then put into the process that we called search, which was to spend about 6 months really searching to see if there's an intervention, set of new ideas, set of grantees, set of ways that we think around this place where there's dynamism, we could really begin to think about putting together an intervention strategy to have high impact. Many things that went into search never got moved further. That caused a little kerfuffle with some of our grantees who, and I think accurately, and we could have and should have communicated better about what phase that grant making meant for us. But there were many things that we didn't continue because we didn't see a space. But it was a quick and 6-month process. The things that we moved out, we put into development where we worked with them further. And then, and only then, did we put something into the intervention, the final stage. Luckily, that was the point, obviously with all of their input before that, but that was the point where the board formally voted yes or no on our work. So they did not approve individual grants, and we did a lot of discussion with them and reiteration in the development phase. But their approval process only occurred when we were taking it into the final intervention phase, and then they would approve a multi-year envelope of dollars. So that was the intervention. For us in that final phase, the mantra was implement, measure, redesign, but we were in this together with our grantees. So we said, you know, the measurement is not your report card. The measurement is for us to all figure out together what's working and what isn't so we can continue to evolve and make changes. And that was a mindset for some of our grantees and even for some of our program officers. And I think has served us well over time. And then the final I, influence, is something that I think was, and maybe still is, more controversial in philanthropy. And that is, we came to feel that influence was more than having a good communications strategy. That influence was really the multiplier of the good work you were funding, and that it didn't only have to come through the mouths of your grantees, that you, the donors, could also be out there as a multiplier, particularly because we were linking our grantees into those intervention strategies. And so how do we have communications, influence policy through leadership, and how do we share learning? All of those, an important element, I think, of influence. And I believe that not enough philanthropies, foundations, even today, use that final tool sufficiently or sufficiently effectively. And so that was quite important for us. I said that I would come back to the other kinds of innovation because I do think it's critical, and I think for the kind of work we do, we often don't spend enough time thinking about organizational innovation or process innovation. So we actually reorganized ourselves as a result of what we saw in that early set of explorations. The world was globalizing. The pace of change was enormously more rapid than anything our predecessors had known. Technology was transforming everything. And so the question is, are we organized as a foundation in a way that allows us to adapt to this new reality and continue to be as effective? And we concluded, at least for us, that problems aren't landing anymore on the ground in convenient packages labeled by Rockefeller program areas. And so we chose to reorganize. We broke down all the program areas. We reorganized ourselves over and over again depending on the initiatives that we were working on. So a lot of shifting teams, a lot of short-term, part-time outside experts who came into a team for a particular initiative and then left. And it was a very, very different structure. And for philanthropy in general was thought of as an organizational innovation. Again, not without its ups and downs, lots of downs. But it served us well in terms of the kind of intervention impact that we wanted to have. The process innovations, I think, were equally critical. So how do we do things differently? I talked about a different approach to risk-taking, a different approach to trying to be nimble. So we went from a foundation where the board approved every grant, which couldn't allow us to be nimble and respond, every grant over 100,000, to one where the approval process and therefore our ability to move quickly was very transformational for how we would work, who would come to us. Often we were called because somebody would say, I know you guys can act quickly. And this is really important. It's not going to wait till your next grant cycle or whatever. And it enabled us to be seen, at least in the areas in which we were working, more as a go-to partner. But also, we got better at being speedy, which is not only to our grantees, but in the way we thought, in the way we responded to our own work, in how quickly, when we looked at metrics, we were really able to readjust and redirect. And for us, that was a real process innovation. And there are others. And I think, critical for leadership to think about process and organizational innovations in their own work and in the organizations that they lead. The market's innovations I've talked about, and it really was around innovative finance, not only in the impact investing field where we got in very early partners and believers, so JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley early created private wealth fund opportunities for some of their clients to invest in impact investing, social impact bonds, obviously a market innovation. But in the later period, we kept pushing the notion of innovative finance. So we've done a lot of work with the insurance and reinsurance industries on how to do things differently or more creatively, and also with the bilateral development donors. And so I'll give you one market innovation that sort of brings them together, and you'll get the flavor of a lot of the things that we were trying, some of which worked, and some didn't, and we were always piloting rigorously and vigorously before we brought it to scale. Through our resilience work, it was very clear to us that around the world, a lot of the money in the world's most vulnerable places that was being spent by the bilateral development agencies, USAID, DFID, NORAD, the Canadians, and the like, was wiped out by the next disaster. And in fact, when they looked at their numbers, and this is the actual number for USAID, when USAID started, they were spending 80% of their resources on development and 20% on recovery. And 5 years ago, it was exactly the inverse. So very little could go to development because they were just spending so much aid on recovery. We had been working with the reinsurers through our resilience work, and they kept saying to us, you know, the governments and philanthropies are not taking advantage of what our business model is, which is we insure risk. And so, and we have phenomenal algorithms that allow us to create these metrics and figure these things out. Up to this point, we were working with them on micro-insurance for farmers in Africa, which, by the way, was terrific. But we had gotten to know and trust each other very well. Fast forward, the innovation that we worked out, which is beyond my imagination in what's going on now, is we looked at the catastrophe bonds that they had created. Mexico was the first country in this hemisphere that bought cat bonds, and obviously they're extremely expensive. So a lot of the countries in the developing world, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa where we had been working so intensively, didn't have the capacity to do it. We then said to Swiss Re, we will find buyers for the cat bonds. We don't want you to reduce the price. We want to create these markets which have to exist if this is going to be a sustainable intervention. So they maintained the price level. We then went to the bilateral donors who were active in a particular country, and we showed them what they were spending on recovery over the prior 5 years as these countries kept getting wiped out. Monsoon, typhoon, earthquake, we know, tsunami, we know the parts of the world, even droughts. And they bought the cat bonds for the country. And then when a disaster happened, Swiss Re paid out instead of them paying out. It cost them somewhere between 1/10 and 1/20 to buy the catastrophe bond of what they had been spending on recovery. So they now are freeing these resources back into development, and hopefully with our assistance, building more resiliently when they invest in development, both hard infrastructure as well as social and economic infrastructure, thinking about resilience principles when they develop that strategy. These kinds of market innovations create such capacity for us as philanthropies to transform the way things are being done, the way people think about their partnerships, and the way we can really serve our mission, which is our beneficiaries on the ground. And so for us, and for me in particular, this has been certainly one of the most exciting innovations. It was really through our work in resilience that we came to think about this. Resilience came about. I'm a psychologist, and actually did some early research on stress and coping. As Kelly knows, we were colleagues. But we didn't call it resilience then, but really the capacity to, at that point, of individuals, who is able to rebound effectively if something bad happens and who isn't, and what are the differences. Rockefeller was extremely active in New Orleans post-Katrina. We were called in and asked by the Louisiana Recovery Authority to intervene and help bring the city to a planning process that would enable them to have a plan that qualified for the federal funds ultimately. And so watching the rebuild of New Orleans and recognizing that all of the structural failures were much more than wind and water. They were social failures of long making. They were economic failures of long standing. They were weakened communities in ways that when something bad happened, like the flood and the storm, then it was not surprising. We continued that work in Asia, where we saw the fastest growth of cities occurring and urbanization, and we worked in 50 what are called second-tier cities, smaller cities, but not small by our standards, but small for Asian standards, that would, the prognostication was that they would have a huge demographic growth over the next 10 or 20 years. And so we created the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, worked with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, and really began to understand what building resilience is on the ground. The critical thing that I want to say here is that this was a huge transformation for the Rockefeller Foundation, because when we started, what made John Dee's insight so incredible was that he said, we're going to focus on the root causes of problems. We are not going to put bandages on weeping wounds, which was his language about trying to solve problems after they occurred and fix them, but try to get to the root cause. Fast forward 100 years, as a result of that early process that I described to you, we really came to believe that in the 21st century, you may not be able to get to the root cause of every problem, that things are happening too quickly, that crisis may be the new normal. And so how do we, in a 21st century model, build the capacity to prepare for and prevent what you can, but be able to rebound more quickly and more effectively for that which you can't predict or prepare for? And then finally, and importantly, if something happens, how do you transform? How do you use it as a growth and change opportunity? The narrative on the ground is often, we just want things to get back to normal. But normal often has all the vulnerabilities built in that made you a higher risk entity in one way or another in the first place. So the third piece of resilience and the insight for us was transformation, not just back to normal. And that began a huge amount of work. We learned a lot in the Asian Cities Resilience Network. We had an in vivo opportunity to really act after Superstorm Sandy in New York, where I was privileged to chair the Recovery Commission for the governor. And so I worked very closely both with the federal agencies and also with the city. And we created a mandate for New York's recovery that really was a blueprint for resilience in energy, in our financing, in our building codes, in our land use codes, that really is evolving still and is transforming the city. Resilience, this will give you the graphic and then you'll understand why we think it's so important. So when we looked at several of the businesses after Sandy hit, they all had their generators in the basement because 9/11 was the prior catastrophe. And so you knew you were going to get hit from the top, right? So you put all your generators in the basement. And so we kept saying, if resilience is about the capacity to withstand anything, not the thing that's in the rearview mirror alone. And that changes the way you intervene, it changes the things you focus on, and itself leads to very different kinds of work and thinking. We worked with the federal government. We were responsible for several $billion of federal recovery dollars, not only that which was spent in the greater New York region, but around the country in a process that Sean Donovan, who was then Secretary of HUD, led for the president, called Rebuild by Design. And here's a great place where philanthropy can be terrific. Sean had $2 billion for housing, small business, a variety of things for the New York region. And what we wanted to do, and he was very, we were influenced by one another's work, was run a global competition where architects and engineers, experts, would work with the local communities so that the rebuild process had what the communities felt they needed, not just what the experts thought they needed, so that you could begin to get more bang for the buck. So if you're building a new bridge anyway, or you're building a flood wall, or you're whatever, can you get more out of it? So we thought a global competition that brought global experts and allowed this money to be juried and dispensed. So Sean had $2 billion, but he didn't have $4 million to run the competition because that wasn't in the budget. So he called and said, can you guys put in the $4 million to run the competition, and then we can free the $2 billion in federal dollars. That began for us a way of thinking about not only how to leverage private capital, but how to leverage government capital differently. How to use our grant money not to replace federal dollars, but to capacitate federal dollars. And that came out of the resilience work that we did, and we've brought that to cities all over the world and to countries all over the world. And the initiative that was the capstone of that was our centennial initiative called 100 Resilient Cities, where we ran a global competition in 3 cohorts. What's stunning about that is that we had 1,100 applicants from 47 countries. And so, and this was not just municipal governments. The requirement was that the application had to come jointly from the private sector, the NGO community, the university community, and municipal government. And that led to a lot of what opened in terms of everybody's way of thinking. 100 Resilient Cities has just completed the work on the 3rd cohort, so now a lot of the projects will be undertaken. And they are quite compelling because they're obviously about natural and built infrastructure, but they are equally about social and economic infrastructure. And so Paris, that thought it was going to be working on the flooding of the Seine, is now, as their first project out of the box after their strategy work, going to tear down the worst of their public schools in the worst of their immigrant slums and rebuild them as optimistic, open window, green space learning centers. And the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, is speaking all over the world about her transformation in thinking about building a resilient city. So for us, this has been amazing. It's the one Rockefeller thing I am my predecessor asked to stay involved in, so my successor, I'm sorry, asked to stay involved in, and I do so with great pleasure. So maybe I'll stop.
Absolutely wonderful. Really.
Thank you.
Well, I can't let this end without saying what a remarkable presentation that was. It's absolutely fascinating. I learned things that I didn't know. There are many, many things I didn't know, and I'm dazzled by what you did there. It just it will continue to benefit not just the foundation structure, but also the rest of society. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Really fascinating.